Well, guess what? We're here again. Energy production. I want to look at the background behind energy production, because energy production is fundamental to human survival. Obviously fire came first, and there are different mechanisms by which people maintained fire sticks. Because fire was important, the light was important, not just to cook their foods, but to keep predators away at night. Obviously, it relied on a simple, plentiful source at that particular point in time, which was wood. Now, as the number of human beings increased, and the types of production increased, the variety of production increased, there came a time when new sources of energy were used. And I'm not talking about dung, cow dung, which is a heating source, or a peat, which is another heating source, or coal. So what we saw with the increase in the human population, the increasing sophistication of the technology, which needed an energy source to work, we saw different energy sources come into vogue. And today we've got nuclear energy, we've got gas-related energy, coal energy, people talk about hydrogen energy, we've got steam and hydroelectricity, and a whole variety of energy sources. Now, obviously, with an increasing complexity of energy production and an increasing human population which relies more and more on energy, any of you that are watching this need to understand that obviously the internet and social media requires energy, and without energy everything comes to a halt in a 21st century society. Now, we've seen with the increasing industrialisation that coal, the burning of coal to provide energy, has had a detrimental effect, not just on individuals, but on the planet as a whole, causing increased temperatures which are directly related to the methods of production we've used. Increasing CO2 emissions are directly related. So the dilemma is we are now moving from one energy source to another energy source. From gas and coal, which provides most of the energy to keep the world ticking over, to what's described as renewable energy. Now, we've always had renewable energy. Wood was a renewable energy, but it's not enough, obviously, to keep the fires burning. So we're talking about renewable energy in terms of decreasing CO2 emissions and decreasing or maintaining temperature at its current rate, because obviously increasing temperature has a profound impact on human beings. So what's happening? We're seeing the expansion of wind, solar, hydroelectricity, and experimentation other sources, including hydrogen, and the expansion of nuclear energy. Now, obviously all have drawbacks, but I'm not particularly interested in this particular presentation in the type of energy source, but how that energy source is structured and who owns the production facilities. Now, we've seen in Australia, in many Australian states, that the fundamental energy sources have been privatised. So what is happening with the extension of the green revolution? Who is benefiting it? is it centralised or decentralised? Because centralised energy sources, the owners of centralised energy sources, whether it's a state, a sovereign nation state, or a private firm or a private corporation, has significant impact on the users of that energy source in terms of its predictability, in terms of its ability to provide all the energy that is required. Now, it pains me to tell you that although the world is moving away from coal and gas into water, wind and solar, that move is being controlled and manipulated by elements in society that wish to provide large centralised energy sources, which they own and control. The beauty of solar and wind, as long as you've got a transmission system, is you do not need large centralised privately owned or publicly owned facilities to provide that energy. Now, all of those of you who've got solar panels on your roofs know that excess energy can be directly loaded into the transmission lines. And you don't need some huge centralised energy source to provide that energy. And that's the dilemma we face today. Although we are moving away from fossil fuels, we are using the same institutional structures and ownership mechanisms which were used to ensure that fossil fuels were centralised energy sources which were controlled and owned by a small minority in society. That's the dilemma we face as we move from one brave new world to the next brave new world. Do we throw our support behind centralised solar, wind and water? Or do we throw our support behind decentralised solar, wind and water and possibly hydrogen? Because the dilemma is that if we continue to support the centralisation of these new energy forms, what will happen is the same people, the same minority, will continue to dominate the energy production field. And not only dominate the energy production field, but determine what type of productive forces as a society we support and which we create and support and expand. And that's a truly important question that we should all be asking ourselves. It's not enough that we move towards solar, wind and water and possibly hydrogen. The question we should be asking ourselves is, should that be centralised? Should it be publicly owned? Should it be privately owned? Because a centralised energy source makes everybody dependent on a small group of people. And in times of civil conflict and war, the destruction of centralised energy sources becomes a primary objective of the other side. Because if there's no energy, there's no capacity to continue to be involved in those destructive processes and in that war. So centralised energy has drawbacks, significant drawbacks in terms of reliability, in terms of being targets in times of conflict, And in terms of ownership, because you know the old adage, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So it makes us hostages to large unaccountable corporations whose major responsibility, as you and I know, is to create ever-increasing profits for their major shareholders. And if we continue on this route of supporting corporatised, centralised new energy sources, we will have the same problems as before. Now, anybody who tells you that it's pie in the sky to talk about decentralised energy sources in a society of, with a population of 8 billion people who are energy hungry doesn't know what they're talking about. Individual support, individual production for transmission mechanisms provides the most reliable mechanism of providing energy, because if 1 or 2 or 3 or 10,000 or 100,000 households, for a variety of reasons, drop off the grid temporarily or maybe even permanently, it doesn't have a significant impact on the amount of energy which is created. What has a significant impact is if some large centralised energy source somehow, for a variety of reasons, whether it's sabotage or mechanical issues or electrical issues, drops out of production, and we see that all the time. So that's the dilemma that we face as a society. I think the debate about fossil fuels and renewable energy is long gone. It's obvious to everybody except those with a financial interest in the fossil fuel industry know that the writing's on the wall, and even those corporations are now diversifying into acquiring and manufacturing these type of energy sources. So the transmission mechanism is essential, but not as essential as we think. Obviously a national grid is important, but what's even more important in a decentralised energy system is for local energy sources to provide energy to localised communities. Now obviously in terms of production it may be a different matter. All that excess energy which is created by specific communities can then go into the transmission, the common transmission line. But much of the energy which is produced by localised wind power and solar power can be used locally. But in terms of heavy manufacturing and energy hungry manufacturing facilities, obviously you need a national transmission network. But in times of disaster, those localised energy production facilities can and will provide the energy for that society to continue to function. It's a little bit like a First Nations group, a group of First Nations people having wood for fire and carrying those fire sticks, or creating learning mechanism by which to create fire and using the wood to look after their immediate needs. But then when maybe a large number of groups come together for important occasions, not only do you have small fires, but also you can create larger fires. And it's the same principle, because principles don't change, and that's what we forget. Technology changes, the type of energy systems we use change, the environment change, but the basic institutional structures which determine the way we live don't change. Are they privately owned on a private investment for private profit mantra? Are they publicly owned where there's cross-subsidisation for areas of the community which cannot produce that energy for a variety of reasons? Are they owned by corporations which own large centralised energy sources which they can then use to bargain for increased prices to the community because there are no alternatives? Are they decentralised, owned by local communities, which provide excess energy to keep the wheels nationally turning? These are all discussions we should be having today. Unfortunately, what we are doing is we are replicating the same structures that have been used for the fossil fuel industry, that have been used for the nuclear fuel industry, that are being used for hydrogen industry, hydrogen-based energy production. Centralised, in the majority of cases, privately owned. So although the mechanism by which we produce energy is changing slowly, but changing, the fact is that the ownership structure, whether it's centralised or decentralised, those debates have been put aside, and people automatically assume that the only way to provide enough energy to keep our 21st century lifestyle functioning is to have large centralised energy sources which in the majority of cases are privately owned. So next time you hear about a new wind farm or a new solar farm or a new hydroelectric scheme, ask yourself those questions. Are the finances which are being used to create these used usefully, or could they be used to create hundreds, if not thousands, of decentralised, reliable, safe, and most importantly of all, essential services which cannot be put out of action through war or through natural disasters because of the decentralised nature of those services? Think about it. The ball's in your court. I've raised the issues. The type of support I'm receiving for these ideas is almost non-existent. But ultimately, in a world where there is an increasing population, finite resources, increasing CO2 emissions, and an economic system dominated by private investment for private profit mentality, it's time that we began asking these questions and, more importantly, began agitating for decentralised energy sources in our communities.